Okay, brilliant. Let's get started. So, for those who don't know me, I'm Luke. My pronouns are they, them. Using somebody's correct pronouns makes you a cooler person. That is an objective fact. I will do a content warning as well that there is a little bit of motion in this presentation, mostly animated GIFs, because I am firmly a millennial. So I'm, as I mentioned before, and as you probably know already, I'm the lead design advocate at zeroheight. I'm sure you probably know who zeroheight are because you've come in here via zeroheight. But also, as part of my work at zeroheight, I write a lot of the articles. I co-host the Design Systems WTF podcast, which is on hiatus at the moment. Also, author the Design Systems Report, the annual State of Design Systems, run and host Converge, and also run and host the Design Systems Award. We are only a team of 4 people on the marketing and advocacy side, so it seems like we're bigger, but from the amount of things that we do, but that's just because we all have ADHD and don't like sleep. But that's not obviously what I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm here to talk about delight. And so I feel like delight is a word that is thrown around by designers a lot. Usually when they want to complain about the work that they're not allowed to do, or like me, when they're on a soapbox trying to tell other designers how to do their jobs. So, why is delight important? And what should we be talking about when we use the word delight? I don't think you can do a talk without having at least one definition in there. So, to delight someone is to give great joy or satisfaction. And I think there's 2 parts to that that are quite important, joy and satisfaction. And I think that when we talk about delight, we focus a lot on the joy part and not as much on the satisfaction part. We kind of aim for delight on a surface level, and quite often we don't sort of go for that deeper level of delight that is actually, in the definition of what delight is. So Aaron Walters talked about this in his book Designing for Emotion, where he redrew Maslow's hierarchy of needs into his hierarchy of user needs. And so he argues that we can't achieve anything further up that pyramid of delight, so the pleasurable bit, without first achieving the parts lower down. So, namely, that your experience is functional, reliable, and useful. And he kind of categorized these. So, he categorized those bottom 3 as areas of deep delight and the top bit as surface delight. So you'll only, as I said, be able to effectively satisfy someone if your product delivers on functionality, reliability, and usability. So that is if your product works as it's expected to, or surprises the user by working better than it's expected to. If it delivers the information that's required when it's required, if it anticipates the user needs and gets them right, very importantly. And if it learns from the user and adapts either through, well, fancy AI, although I haven't really seen many instances where AI can adapt in a way that the user might expect, um, or just through, product team actually listening to the users and delivering to what the users need via product updates. And then, very importantly, it does all of these things reliably and consistently. Because if you don't have that reliability and if you don't have that consistency with those updates, then it's probably not delivering on that delight anyway, because it's not, delivering things when they're expected or working as it's expected. So basically, creating an exceptional user experience is a precondition for deep delight. Now, deep delight is how you create lifetime customer value. It's more likely to be embedded in a user's day-to-day life, and it's how you create psychological safety with your users. Which is not to say that surface delight isn't important. So to me, surface delight is kind of the difference between McDonald's and a fancy restaurant like Nobu or Fat Duck or any other Michelin-starred restaurant. I mean, 'cause when you break it down, like McDonald's is an incredibly efficient machine that prioritizes consistency, quality, and usability. Quality being a very relative term there. They satisfy those basic needs really well. But to me, it's the focus on pleasure via high quality ingredients and techniques and atmosphere, amongst so many other things that would elevate a, Nobu or high-end burger chain from something like McDonald's. They both satisfy those basic needs, but the surface delight is what gets people talking. It's kind of what gives people FOMO as well, and it's what makes, people excited to tell their friends about it. Especially in the saturated market that we live in today, where it's rare to have an app or a website that truly differentiates on core experience, that surface delight is often the area where you can most easily differentiate. Creating like happiness or joy or any other positive emotional reactions can make you stand out and excel compared to your to your competitors, sorry. When it comes down to it, that surface delight is like an amplifier for the good that you're already doing by having, your app or your website be, functional and usable. So if you want some more science around this, Noriaki Kano developed the Kano model, although I can't figure out if it's Kano or Kano. I'm pretty sure it's Kano. But he developed this model back in the 80s that shows that customer loyalty is connected to our emotional responses to product features. So he did a similar thing to Aaron Walters in that he split up these features into a hierarchy. So you have your must-be qualities. These are your basic needs. They're the expected qualities. So without your basic needs satisfied in the product, you're never going to get satisfaction from the user. It's kind of like, if we were taking a cupcake, is it a cupcake? Does it look like a cupcake? Is it actually made to be a cupcake? These are the basic needs. Then you have the one-dimensional qualities, which are like the performance needs. So these are the things that make things work better, the performance improvements. These offer satisfaction to a user when they're fulfilled well, but importantly, they offer dissatisfaction when they're not fulfilled well. So this is like, what the cupcake tastes like, so that the recipe was actually followed, that it has the flavors you expect, that it doesn't have pockets of flour in it. Then you have your attractive qualities. And so these are the delighters. These are the sprinkles on top. They satisfy when they're fulfilled well, but they don't actually change anything in satisfaction with the user when you don't fulfill them. So these are the things that really spark delight. These are the garnishes, that making it look extra special, or the extra special recipe that you follow, the pocket of cream in the middle, the moist red center of a red velvet. Getting really hungry now. But there are also in different qualities and reverse qualities that Kano had in his model, but I'll come back to those later because they're important, but for other reasons. So in essence, what Kano found was that the more that you lay on, the more satisfaction you get. But if you don't meet those base level needs, customers won't be satisfied with the experience. And without those basic needs met, the performance needs mean nothing. And without the performance needs met, delighters mean nothing. So it's kind of like something that you have to stack on top of each other. It's also interesting that the must-haves, the basic needs, actually do tail off in terms of how much they delight a user. So they'll only get to a certain point before you'll stop getting those sort of like the benefits of having them. Performance needs tend to work on more of a linear progression, and then delighters actually work on an exponential progression. So the more delighters you add in, the more satisfaction you get. He also noted that over time and with greater exposure to these things, the delighters can actually move between the different layers. So delighters can become performance needs, and then performance needs can become basic needs with exposure. So basically, sort of today's, shiny, the things that we find as delighters today can become tomorrow's table stakes. And we see this in tech, right? So a good example is like the pull to refresh that I think was popularized by Twitter. And I don't know if anybody remembers when this first came out, but it was just a really nice little interaction pattern that felt special when it first came out. I don't know, the original Foursquare when they released Swarm, when they sort of split the products out, and they had the little lovely illustration at the top when you sort of pulled to refresh. It was something that, for me at least, maybe I'm just a nerd, but it really sparked a little bit of joy. However, now this is kind of like a obvious thing that people expect. It has almost become an affordance. Or another one is Slack's slash command. They didn't invent it, but I think, again, they like popularized it. But that slash command is now absolutely everywhere and is kind of expected in any product that has any kind of um, uh, any interaction pattern that will kind of make sense for this, especially if you're in kind of any editor experience. Um, so the we actually had this with zeroheight, where when we first did the editor experience, we didn't have the slash command because it wasn't something that was actually that sort of common. And then because of apps like Notion, it just became an expected feature. So when we didn't have the slash command, which took way too long for us to put in, it people actually thought that the app was broken or outdated. So it was something that we kind of had to put in because it just became a table stake. So anyway, I'd argue that as product teams, we're actually still struggling with this deep delight part of the pie. Um, I don't think that we've kind of got that functional, usable thing really down pat. A lot of teams do, but not everyone. But creating functional, reliable, usable products is another talk, and that's not what we're going to talk about today. I want to focus on that surface delight part, as I think it is definitely the thing that is most often sacrificed in product teams, especially when it comes to, maybe this is more of a startup thing, but the MVP obsessed product culture that I think has been ingrained in a lot of people in product teams. So from now on, let's assume that when I'm talking about creating delight, I'm talking about creating surface delight. So what different types of delight are there? I really like Microsoft's categorizations of the 5 patterns of delight. So those are, sorry, I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. Those are playful, attractive, natural, personal, and empowering. And I'll do a quick run through of like those and how they relate to products. So playful experiences are obviously the ones that sort of try and elicit smiles and laughter. They encourage people to enjoy what they're doing, not just focus on getting it done. And they're good for providing an emotional boost to your users. I think a good example of this, MailChimp back in the day. So this is slightly old. I don't think they have these interactions anymore. But before you sent an email, you had that sweaty finger sort of hovering over the button to push it, and the high five once you sent it. They're just really nice moments of whimsy that make something that can be relatively, well, is relatively boring in sending emails, just have that little moment of delight there. Attractive kind of speaks for itself. So we're talking about aesthetically pleasing, or more importantly, aesthetically pleasing to your specific demographic. So we're, with aesthetic choices and aesthetic pleasure, we're aiming for not just it looking nice, but a sense of belonging, or aspirational belonging. So it's telling the story of the product through aesthetic choices and trying to make those choices fit with how that user sees themselves fitting in with sort of your demographic or who you're trying to aim for. It's very much a shortcut to bring people into your brand, who you want to bring into your brand, and also kind of like exclude people who you don't want to be in your brand through the aesthetic choices. Natural experiences. So natural experiences are comfortable and intuitive. This is where I think a lot of satisfaction comes in. I think natural experiences excel at making a user feel at home in what they're doing. And a lot of the time they're trying to play off of memory or affordances, um, to be honest, sometimes bordering on mimicry to achieve it. But very much trying to play on the things that we already know and love. So things like skeuomorphism is an obvious one of like natural delight or natural experiences. But I also think Headspace do a really good job of this, where everything in the UI of Headspace feels very calm and linked to mindfulness and breathing. And they use a lot of this motion to kind of achieve this, as well as the color palettes, where everything just feels like it's like the experience of breathing and being mindful in your breathing. And they extend this all through the app. So again, this is a slightly old screenshot, but they're sleep casts to the point where even sort of a sub product within their product, the color choices, the illustration choices, and the interaction choices kind of mimic that feeling of being sleepy and being calm before going to bed, which is a really nice experience of like trying to get you into that emotional mindset to take full advantage of the product. And then personal experiences. So personal to me is about empowering the user. So obviously this is very much around personalization and allowing the users to personalize, or even better, automatically personalizing based on the experience that a user has had with the product or assumptions. With the massive caveat that you need to get those assumptions right if you're going to make those assumptions to personalize. But personalization empowers the user and helps them ground it in a routine because it's what they feel like they need, because it is personal to them and it gives them agency. So again, another good example of this, an obvious example, I think, is like Spotify with the way that they pulled in their personalized playlists. Now, they get this right and they don't get this right. I think that's another another talk entirely into the algorithms that power these things. But I, again, from personal experience, this was something that really leveled up my usage of Spotify when they started to do some of these like Discover Weeklies and the release radars that were personalized to me based off of my listening experience and my taste. And now it seems like that personalization has really just gone rampant in Spotify, but really hooks you in because it feels like it's very much geared just to you, as opposed to a whole demographic or a whole swathe of population. Then there's empowered experiences. So this is where you feel like you've got sort of superpowers by making a user feel like they're doing something that is hard in an easy way, and doing it in an easier way than they've done it before. So it leaves the user feeling delighted with themselves and what they've done. It also sort of is a way to elicit that kind of appreciative emotion for the sort of time and cognitive effort that they've saved. Oop. And this one's actually quite a hard one to find good examples of, the empowered one. Although actually today it's probably slightly easier with with experiences that try and do this with all of the AI tools out there. But I do think that like Medium was an early example of this, where they kind of like through the design choices of how you wrote, it made things feel very focused and therefore easy. And also, even in just simple things like the microcopy that they use, the fact that the heading starts with "What should I write today?" It kind of gives you that prompt of like what you're trying to do. And then writing became a lot easier as well, just because the intuitive interface that they built into this was way better than anything out there at the time. I don't know if anybody remembers the olden days of blogging in LiveJournal or Blogger, but it was pretty hideous from an experience point of view, and didn't make you feel like you were wanting to write because of the way that it was designed. So, a quick note before we get into the systems part of this. Not all of these obviously make sense for your product, and it is very much something where you should kind of pick and choose what makes sense for your audience. Not everybody wants whimsy if you're doing things like checkout flow or, um, you know, destructive actions. It's not somewhere where you really want to have, I don't know, crazy animations that try and make you laugh. These are things that instead of using, basically just imagine that I've put that with great power comes great responsibility quote from Spider-Man that everybody uses in every talk. But it is one of those things where this is where you pick and choose what you use, and it should be done with intention is the important thing here. So how do you systematize delight? So all good design systems start at a foundation and then build up from there. We all know this. Um, so basically, I think that we should be starting with delight at the atomic level or at the foundational level, because atomic design. It's another talk entirely as to whether we should use the terminology of atomic design, but um, I think that we should be looking at delight at a foundational level. So obviously, we usually think of foundation as where your, things like colors and typography and spacing and grids, all those kind of things are defined. But I also think it's where it's important to define things like your design principles and your core guidelines. And this is where you should establish those as well. And this is the important bit. But before we even get to this, when we're talking about design systems, I actually want to go one level above to the organizational level. So if you haven't already, work on a design team charter. It feels like a bit anachronistic to talk about this in the context of delight, because I don't think a lot of people would see doing a workshop on developing your design team charter as a delightful process. But for those who don't know what a design team charter is, it's a foundational document that defines how your team works, but also what your team values as well. So it's what the values your team has when you're approaching what you work on. They provide a consensus for what you do and how you do it, and help you ingrain and encode important things into your team. And that's why I think it's important when it comes to delight, because if delight is something that is important for you as a company and what you want to build in your product, then it's important to enshrine something like building delightful experiences and what that means to you in your design team charter. If you want a template for a workshop on how to write a design charter, my lovely co-host, Design Systems WCF, wrote this amazing article and workshop template for how to create a design team charter, which you can find at that link. And if you want to know more about design team charters, then I would highly recommend reading Org Design for Design Orgs by Peter Meerholtz and Kristen Skinner. If you're interested in design leadership at all, actually, it's kind of like a foundational text and everybody should read it. So please go and do that. So then the next level down are your principles. So I'm hoping everybody has design principles, and I'm hoping they have them all documented in your design system. But your principles are kind of similar to your values, but are more focused on the work that you create. So the outputs of the product team and something that should be enshrined at a systems level. They're a oh no, you're getting a 404 for the design charter link. I'll update that and I'll share that in the chat and after I've finished talking. Sorry about that. There so yes, where was I? So the principles are about your outputs. So there's a few statements. Basically, your design principles are a few statements to cover off the most important things when it comes to the things that your team creates. What they do is they kind of enable you to have a guiding light when you're deciding on solutions. And to me, more importantly, especially when we're talking in the context of how much delight you build into that, the scope of the solutions that you build. They also act as blunt objects to beat people over the head with when someone isn't satisfying the principles or you're having arguments in your team. Or maybe, as a less combative way of explaining it, just good focal points for conversations. But I think that enshrining delight in your principles is a first step in saying, like, we believe in this and we're prioritizing this. So we actually did this at my last company before I joined zeroheight. I used to work for a company called Memrise, which was a language learning company. And we had this principle in our design principles, which was keep it wonky, which was we were all about like learning, but learning in a fun way, as every ed tech company seems to be. And one of those things we wanted to really get that across in the products that we built and the designs that we did, um, by making it feel sort of human and squishy and tactile and playful, because we felt that if you weren't sort of enjoying the experience of learning, then you probably weren't going to stick with it, because, you know, as we know from the Kano model, the more delight you have in a product, the more sticky it is, and the more people are likely to sort of stick around. um, and so, you know, we just had this really simple statement, and it was a really simple like TLDR, of, you know, this should be playful, tactile, and squishy. Folks using it should be able to feel the buttons they're pressing. We don't do clean Swiss design. We don't have straight lines. If it's got a hard corner or a straight line, then put a wonk on it. Um, and, you know, the important thing here is to not only get across what you're trying to achieve, but trying to also maybe encapsulate a little bit of like what you're not trying to achieve. So, setting up the, you know, how you do it, like what not to do and what to do. And then also put a little bit of color in it to actually make people, you know, feel something when they're reading it as well. And so, I mean, whether we achieved this or not in Memrise, is another question. But as you can see here is some of the examples. Like everything just had a little bit of roundedness to it. There was a little bit of like squishiness to everything. There were no straight circles. Everything was kind of like these weird, which was really fun to try and implement from the dev side of things. Um, all of the interactions were very like squishy. We had lovely sound interactions as well that kind of helped along with that. But it also meant that whenever we were building new interfaces, we had to keep this in mind, so that we were trying to make something that satisfied that design principle. And when somebody didn't satisfy that design principle and they created something that was just too clean, or too um, cold, then we could use that in critiques and say, hey, you know, is it wonky enough? So, um, also, it could be a bit of a sort of make everything a learning opportunity for your product. If you were, sorry, when you're thinking of how you'd write this into your design principles, it's not doesn't just have to be about making things playful and whimsical. It could also be around something like make everything a learning opportunity for your product. If you were trying to prioritize empowering delight, or make it feel like sinking into a sofa if you're trying to encapsulate that kind of like natural or aesthetic delight you're trying to capture. Um, Again, if you want some advice on writing good principles, I'm really hoping that Bitly link works, but I haven't checked it for a while, so I might have to share this afterwards. But we do have a blog post on tips for writing effective design principles. So having these things enshrined at a values and then a principles level for both your design and your product teams means that you can start having those conversations about what that V stands for in MVP. Um, I have seen people use minimum delightful product, but it makes me want to throw up in my mouth a little bit. Because to me, I think actually viability does capture it well. Viability should be a combination of user needs and org needs. So if one of your org needs is to create a product that elicits an emotional response or encourages users to stick around without providing any kind of extrinsic motivation for them to stick around, then there should be a shared understanding between your teams that delighting users is part of the viability. As I said, minimum lovable product or minimum delightful product, it's just kind of underselling the fact that you're trying to build something that's viable. And I think that calling it anything other than viable kind of devalues how important delight can be to succeeding, because it is actually part of the viability, if it's the case for your product. And if it is the case for your product, then I think it is really important to be explicit and get that shared understanding, and language when you're talking sort of between your teams around this. So I feel like I've copped out a little bit. when we're talking about this in a design systems context, by talking about all the ways that you should systematize delight via principles or your team or culture, when what you probably want is some advice on practical ways how to make delight a core concern of the design system. So that's what the rest of the talk is. When we talk about delight in design systems, there's two aspects that are very important to consider here. There's building delight for the users of your design system, so the folks who actively consume your design system. And then there's making it so you factor delight into what you're building in your design system for your end users. So let's start with the end users, because that's probably what most people think about. So I actually think one of a really strong way to build delight into your design system is actually through illustration and illustration systems. And it's something I don't think a lot of people think about when they think about design systems. They think more about just components. Product illustration is a super powerful way of getting really complex concepts across in simple ways. We probably all know this. I think they're also great for providing the user a really quick sort of shortcut for what emotional state we think they should be in when they're using the product. Um, using color, type, motion, and very specifically faces and body language gives the user that kind of like marker for how they should be feeling at that point when they're using your product. So to start with, when we think of an illustration system, we could just say it's, um, well, basically like the bare bones of what an illustration system should be is probably just some standards and guidelines. Because one of the problems with product illustration is that it can be really costly and hard to scale if you don't have in-house illustrators who work on this. Um, and illustration system, but like when it comes down to it, illustration systems are just a way of codifying your illustration patterns. And you can do that via guidelines, templates, and libraries. And that's like the simplest form of an illustration system. So how to use illustrations, how to make illustrations, and libraries for people to use those within the product. But they can also be uh, modular illustration systems, which are really cool. And I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see these, but a really good example of these is Blush as a product. So this is a product that tries to make illustration systems sort of available if you don't have the capacity to build them internally. And to be fair, what the folks over at Blush, which is at blush.design, have created is pretty cool and mind blowing. And I think it changed the way that I viewed how illustration could be created. So basically, what they've done is they've created a whole bunch of ready-made illustration systems that allow you to use interchangeable elements to customize illustrations, so that a stock set of like tens or up to like 100 of illustrations can be turned into hundreds, thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands different combinations without having an illustrator on your team, because these are all just basically components and variables that you can switch out to sort of create a whole bunch of different scenarios, from characters through to fully blown sort of like scenarios, built up scenes. And if you want to set these up yourself, they're not actually, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here. They're not actually that hard to do. They can be quite complex when you go down the route, but really all they do require is a bunch of variants and then nesting them in a way that makes sense when you're trying to sort of create things. So this is an example of one that I created in a couple of hours for a talk that I did on illustration systems, to create like a character. And basically all it is just setting out all those different components and then setting them up as variations and then just testing them out to make sure that they work. And then locking it down in a way that you can't create anything that is either going to be something that can't be used, or is not going to work because particular variations don't work together. If you are interested in illustration systems, I'd massively recommend the talk by Bonnie Kate Wolf on illustration systems for the illustration system that she created for OpenTable. You can also watch my inferior one, which is shorter if you have a short attention span. But if you look up building illustration systems, Luke Murphy, then you'll find that online as well on YouTube. But definitely go and check those out because Bonnie goes into a lot of detail into how she actually created the illustration system there. And it's really interesting. Next up, microcopy. How am I doing for time? We're getting there. So another area that is often underloved within design, I feel, is content. I was genuinely surprised when we did the report earlier in the year by the lack of content specialists. This has been ongoing since we first started doing the design system report. The amount of content specialists that seem to be within design systems, maybe they're just not filling in our survey. But I also can only count on one hand the amount that I know within the industry. And I think that it's something that kind of blows my mind because words and visuals are the main tools for conveying meaning and information to users. And filling both of these with personality is a quick way to inject joy into your product, as well as just making it usable. So, systematizing microcopy is easy. First off, hire a content specialist because everybody can do that because everybody has endless resources, right? But even if you don't do that, just write some content guidelines and take some time to think about how you're writing your content creation guidelines. I feel like we often do this for marketing copy, but product copy goes a little bit unloved. And it often comes down to, I don't know, a lot of the teams I've worked with, it's often come down to the designer who's doing the screen to chuck something in there, which makes me shudder a little bit. As somebody who also has a content background because it's just not their main priority or main concern. So I do think it's one of those things where if you can hire a content specialist, do it because it can really level up your experience. But also if you don't, then at least write some content guidelines and get the team together to decide on how you're going to approach the content, where to use, where to inject joy and where not to inject joy. And again, with a lot of these things, it just comes down to intention. And then one of the other obvious ways to inject light into your product is motion. So it's another thing that gets left by the wayside, I feel, in the pursuit of MVP. Um, Adding in expressive motion into your products just really brings it to life. It celebrates the interaction, it adds character, and it's a great way of conveying brand as well. So to keep our brand teams happy. Um, Apart from leaving room in the product process for motion, which I think is one of those things that, again, is just something that you kind of have to agree at a team level, or having minimum guidelines for components that include animation. I do also think that obviously tokens is one area that can help us smooth out these bumps a lot. You can set those token values to at least get the sort of bare bones of what good motion is into how people implement it in the product. So making sure that you're actually going through and setting all of those, crazy Bezier curves as tokens so people can really easily use them. And then you've got that consistent motion across your product as well. And it means that people don't have to faff about with it as much. Also, things like Lottie are just making advanced motion so much easier to implement. I mean, I think that a lot of people know about Lottie now, but if you don't, check it out. It's a really great way to just spit out really complex animations in a really usable way from After Effects. That is really easy to implement on the dev side as well, because it's literally just like a JSON file and loads of SVG in a lot of instances. So that's kind of like on the front end user part of this. But as I mentioned before, it's not just about your external users. I think your internal users are just as important, and design system teams need to remember this as well. Delighting your internal users can kind of lead to customer loyalty because, remember what Kano said. Customer loyalty is connected to our emotional responses to products. So when it comes to internal tooling, that customer loyalty translates into adoption and love for your internal tools. The higher the adoption and the higher the love, the greater satisfaction you get, and also the less chance you'll have of your design system being deprioritized because you'll have those champions around the business. Um, and if you have those champions around the business because they love your product, because you're not only delivering something that is functional and usable, but also delights them, the higher chance that you'll have of having those champions to help you get the resources you need to keep growing that design system in the team. And as I said, the most important thing when it comes to delight, and we need to remember this when we're dealing with internal tools as well, is making sure that your design system and the docs and the processes are all usable, reliable, and functional. Because without any of that, you won't be able to capitalize on any of the surface delight that you add that deepens your emotional connection, your user's emotional connection to the design system. So you've created a usable, reliable system. Now it's also time to lock that down by creating a system that causes happiness. I mean, if we want to go into the why, a happy, content, satisfied product is good for business because happy teams are good teams. And there's actually studies that show this. Oxford University did a study back in 2019 that showed that teams that are happy day to day are 13% more productive in their jobs. Happy people tend to stick around longer. And if your base needs are met, as in, you're taken care of by the company, you're paid enough, all of those kind of things, then happiness is what keeps you at a job and makes you less likely to look around or be easily poached. And from a selfish point of view, I don't know, when it comes down to it, knowing that you make a positive impact on the people you work with just makes your job, your day-to-day job, a little bit more worthwhile. Also, as I said, if they're happy, they're more likely to start acting as internal champions for you, and can provide that really good qualitative data on how much you impact their work. But how do you do this? So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of delightful things I've seen from folks. So this is actually outside of design systems, but I think it's a great little bit of surface delight that was built into the HTTP specs from a million years ago, way back in the dark ages of the 1990s. So they included this as an April Fool's joke, but it actually stayed in the HTTP spec. So this is, the error codes you get, like 404, like the links I've been sharing, or 503, when the server's not responding. Is that the right one? 418 is I'm a teapot, which you get to when the service that you're trying to call is permanently a teapot. I don't actually know how you'd get this error back, but I just love the fact that it's in the specs and it's a nice little Easter egg. And the fact that they kept it in there. Did they need to include this? No. Does it bring some people joy? Hopefully. Another great little Easter egg is GitLab including a socks component in their documentation. Again, I think this was just included for shits and giggles from the design system team and serves no real purpose, but it provided that little moment of like unexpected joy when I was going through the GitLab design system docs, where I was like, oh wow, I don't know, it's just a little bit of fun, right? But it's not just about creating slightly useless Easter eggs as well. You can also do it through other ways like Motion. So Brainly, who are an edtech company, have filled their design system docs with these cute little animations that add a whole load of personality, and they're not used outside of the design system docs. So they're created specifically for the design system docs. So their design system is called Pencil, thus the pencil animation. I just want to run that again, just because I love the way that it builds. They tickle the brain in just that really nice little way that sort of makes people, I don't know, a little bit delighted. But also they serve a deeper level function as well, because they showcase the sort of level of polish and the motion and the level of creativity that they're trying to enshrine at that sort of the deep level of the design system, and to enshrine that level of delight by showing what they're doing and not just telling all through their design system docs. Another example of having fun with copy or visuals that you could use in your documentation is using in examples and do's and don'ts. Using utterly ridiculous example for your do's and don'ts can just inject a bit of fun and personality, as long as they still get the point across, right? Did Material UI need to include a truck-shaped button for the sake of saying don't use shapes that make components unrecognizable? No. Did it bring somebody joy? Well, I know it definitely brought the person who created it joy. So at least one person found this delightful and just created a little bit of I don't know, niceness. But even if it's just in your change logs and release notes, like Societe Generale, who, if you don't know them, they're a big French financial services company. Their release notes are injected with stupid jokes and puns. So, picture this: a dark alley, rain, and a bit of thunder. So, probably just imagine London lurking in the shadows, the picker. They did this just to introduce the fact that the picker can be used in Shadow DOM. It's stupid, but the person writing this clearly just did it as a little bit of a way to spice up the change logs. The funny thing is, it actually gave them results. So aside from having, just going to read the quote quickly. Aside from having fun writing some extremely unfunny jokes, which probably brought us the most joy, we found that our jokes were having some unintended side effects. People were actually reading them. After we started the jokes, word spread, and we almost doubled the number of people subscribed to them. So the lesson here is that puns have business value. Um, so they actually doubled the amount of people who were reading their communication about what's changed in the design system by making them a bit more fun to read. So adding the delight actually did have measurable value. And finally, it doesn't only have to be in the docs themselves. So one of the ways I've seen design system teams delight their users is by creating merch to give out internally. These little moments of delight can, make your users have a connection to what you're doing. And, you can still go down a pretty straightforward route if you're not the kind of company who does things that are whimsical. Um, like the stuff that the Vodafone team have done, where they've created these "our design system is fine" stickers to hand out internally, or even just that beautiful like Gov UK design system working group alumni sticker that makes people feel that delight of being part of the community and part of something that's being built. So finally, what does it all mean if you can't see what impact you've had? When it comes down to it, you're probably not going to be able to find a single measure that will show impactful change on, at a big level with adding delightful parts to your design system. However, I do think that NPS scoring and team happiness are good measures if you're trying to change wholesale how folks feel about what you're trying to do. I do think one of the most important things with this kind of stuff is actually the qual measures as well. So getting those quotes from people when you've been trying to implement some of these things to tell your story and sort of tell via the qual quotes and testimonials how this is impacting somebody's work or impacting their life. Get those quotes so you can strengthen the case that you make on a numbers level. And then also, one last thing to mention, causing delight is a tricky business. So it doesn't always work. It's what Kano talks about. I mentioned the indifferent qualities and negative qualities. So indifferent qualities are those which have absolutely no effect on the user from an emotional point of view. So, it's just one of those things where you can put in the effort and nothing happens. Whereas negative qualities are like table stakes in that it doesn't matter how well they're fulfilled. If they're a negative quality, they will always cause dissatisfaction. And a large part of those things come down to taste. When it comes to delight, especially, some people just don't find cutesy or quirky things delightful. Others don't have the cultural experiences or the cues to relate to if you're, relying on affordances or memories. Uh, if you're trying to make your Western focused natural interface accompanying experience, it might not resonate with somebody who has a different cultural background. So remember, we often deal with very diverse user bases these days. So if you assume or guess ways to empower and they don't land, it could end up harming an experience for some users. This is all okay. You can make these mistakes, but it's also why testing with users is really important with delight. So you obviously won't be able to show your designs to everyone, won't be in the same context, but you should get some heads up on what works and what doesn't. And then you can use that to inform decisions on what stays and what doesn't if you're trying to put delight into your product. Just make sure that when you're doing testing, it's with a diverse user base of different cultures, ages, genders, backgrounds, etc. And yeah, for a talk about delight, I feel like I haven't actually been that delightful myself, but I'm hoping there's a few tips in there that will help you build delight into your product process in a scalable fashion. And that's it. And we're bang on time. So I didn't actually do that in the time that I thought I would. um, but if anybody has any questions and wants to stick on for a little bit, I can stay on for an extra sort of 5 or 10 minutes. But I hope that was helpful for folks. This is the problem with just delivering to a webinar audience is I don't have that lovely feedback of faces that